Hello everyone. Welcome to this ASMEBITESIZE session on patient narratives in undergraduate clinical education. A few housekeeping notes before we get started. The session will last approximately 40 to 45 minutes, and we really want you to get involved with the conversation. You should see that there's a chat button at the bottom of your screen, and if you want to ask a question, please use the chat field. We may not get time to answer all of your questions, but we will provide a document after the webinar with any questions we are unable to address. The chat field can also be used for you to contribute to the conversation with comments, and we may invite you to expand on your comments by asking permission to make your audio and video live. So if you want to become a temporary panelist, then please respond via the chat feed that you're happy for us to add you and to join the discussion and expand on your comments. This webinar is being recorded, and a video of the webinar will be made available on the ASME website a few days after this session, along with any other support materials. And finally, if you're having any technical problems, please could you contact ASME by emailing events@asme.org.uk rather than adding them to the comments field. So without further ado, Selina, over to you.
So good afternoon, everyone. Lovely to sort of be introduced to you all in the chat. And I'm really excited to get this discussion started with you this afternoon. So what I'd like to do before I get into my presentation is ask you to take a poll, and I'm going to copy that link into the chat now. So I think the instructions, as far as I understand them, are that you would need to copy and paste that link into your browser, and you'll be given a list of options about how, either as a student or an educator, you have used or experienced patient narratives in medical education. So obviously, as I said, this is in real time, so it might change a little bit. But we can see at the top, we've got using experience or using in our own educational practice patient narratives to encourage empathy, communication skills. I've given the example of breaking bad news sort of workshops, but obviously there's a lot more that comes under the umbrella of communication skills, professionalism, case-based learning scenarios, and obviously this is something that's a development since I completed the study about using these narratives during lockdown to sort of give a flavour of what students are missing out on the ward, clinical experience. And if there is anything else, if you please could let us know about that in the chat, that would be really interested to hear. Okay, so I'm now going to attempt to share my screen and get going with the presentation.
In the meantime, had a couple of interesting comments about the other ways of using patient narratives. So people have been using patient narratives to introduce students to the humanities, which is quite interesting. We've had people use patient narratives in faculty development as well, and to talk about the relationships between work and learning and look at the hidden curriculum.
Yeah, so they're all, again, really, really interesting applications, and I hope we can maybe touch on some of those during the presentation and then revisit them again in the discussion. So thank you very much for those contributions. So first of all, can you all see my screen? So thank you, Ryan, for that introduction, and thank you all for everyone who's attending today. I am really, really honoured that you've given me your time and given me this platform to share my experiences with you. I'm going to talk about patient narratives in undergraduate clinical education, which was my submission for this year for the Sir John Ellis Student Prize. And I'd like to extend my thanks to the Association and the Junior Association for the Study of Medical Education for awarding me the prize and giving me the opportunity in this platform to talk to you today. And also big thanks to my supervisor, Dr. Jane Garner, who encouraged me and supported me throughout this project. Also, of course, I want to extend my thanks to all the participants who took the time to share their experiences with me and made this study possible. Just a little bit of my own housekeeping about a note on confidentiality, and I'm sure we're all aware how important it is to anonymise information, both patients and participants in the study, to ensure we're using narratives ethically. And that's certainly something that I have done in the study. So what we're going to cover today. So it's going to be a very, very short introduction on my background and how I became interested in this area. The project outline, including my aims, methods, and data collection, and the findings or results. So what I did with the data, thematic analysis, and the educational and professional applications that sort of came out of this work. And towards the end, I think it's also really important to reflect on the limitations of the work, look to the future, perhaps particularly within the context of lockdown, and be really interested to hear your experiences about how patient narratives could be used in the situation we currently find ourselves in, and getting to the really interesting bit, which is your experiences and the discussion in general. So moving on a little bit about my background. So I graduate today from Liverpool Medical School. I have been what we term up here sub F1 as part of the COVID response. And in about 10 days, I'm going to be starting as an F1 at Wirral University Teaching Hospital. So before medical school, I was classed as, when I applied, I was classed as a mature student. So I started at the grand old age of 27, didn't have a scientific background. I studied arts and humanities, and my particular focus was in literature and looking at teaching English and Spanish as well, and looking at literature in both of these languages. So I think maybe from this you can glean why I might become interested in patient narratives. So it was a combination of that background and also early clinical attachments. So that means, so at Liverpool, for me, that was from the second year of the degree onwards. And I know that's quite early compared to some other medical schools. And if there are any students who have any sort of feeling on clinical attachments, I'd really love for you to share those with us in the chat. And I was interested in the relationship between patient autonomy, language, and education. So I've become quite conscious that patient narratives within clinical practice is not, that particular phrasing is not something that we necessarily use that often, and have had, people might not be familiar with that. So this is my very personal take on reflecting what I've learned through this project. So whatever your current role may be, sort of invite you to join me in going through these steps. So in its most fundamental form, a patient narrative is that personal first-hand account as told by the patient. And I was sort of lamenting that we might not have sort of patient representatives with us in the audience today, but then obviously it occurred to me that we could reflect on this ourselves and consider our own experiences of patients, which obviously at some point in our lives we all have had or will have. So that was the first step. And then the second step is obviously the history, what we would call the history. So we don't work in isolation. Those of us who work within healthcare teams, we need to relate these personal first-hand accounts to our other team members to provide optimal care. I think the ways in which that can be done are very interesting. And the third step, now obviously the applications to medical education are huge. So as we saw with some of the options that were in the poll, patient narratives can be used to achieve really broad range of learning objectives that are applicable to experiences both as a student and a teacher. And then step 4 is something that's relatively new to me that I've started considering, is about cutting out the middleman, as it were. How can we have what we experienced in step 1, so these first-hand personal accounts, without sort of any intermediary, and incorporate them directly into medical education. So this is something that I don't have a lot of experience in. So those who do, I'd really love to hear from you in the chat about this, about whether we should do it and how we might go about doing that. So from this point, I started doing some reading, and these were my starting points for thinking about my aims, which we're going to talk in a minute. And these formed the background to the study. So I looked at data from NHS England and as well looked at how the complaints were coded. And it seemed to me, this was at the time when I started the study in 2017, but I think this probably does still hold today. It seemed to me that patient complaints were largely to do with communication or breakdown in communication. That's how they were coded. So that started me thinking, what's going on here? Is this a potential learning opportunity? How might we use these patient stories to maybe look at this a little bit deeper? And then this led me on to the idea of language and power. So thinking about that second step that we just talked about, so relating patient histories. How are we linguistically framing patients' experiences when we retell their stories? And importantly, who's the protagonist? Are we making ourselves, on whatever role we're occupying, center of those stories? Or are we trying to honor and preserve the meaning of those narratives as they were originally told to us by the patient? So obviously this is very complex, quite a broad issue. And then obviously coming back to medical education, how can we or should we use patient narratives within medical education? And is there any scope to incorporate them more formally? And obviously with recent developments, maybe thinking about when students can't have access to patients, is there a way that we might be able to use those? So as I said, this was the starting point that brought me onto my aims, which were to investigate the usefulness of patient narratives in undergraduate medical teaching from the perspective of clinical educators. So that's what I'm focusing on today, but I think there are a lot of applications, and I would love to hear from students as well about their experiences, or people like myself who might just be graduating and starting their careers. Second aim was to collect original data via semi-structured qualitative interviews. And thirdly, to examine how patient narratives are used within the specific context of teaching hospitals in the northwest of England. So came up with these aims in 2017 as a second year medical student. The data collection happened late 2017 and into 2018. And that's when I submitted the project as part of my university work. And then this year is when it's been a really lovely opportunity to come back and critically revisit this. And hopefully it's going to be the starting point for our conversations today. So just very briefly, a little bit about how I started my methods. So I did a literature search, and you can see here my why I did it: to establish a current evidence base and ground my findings, also a bit about the search terms and exclusion criteria. But the take-home point is that there were no articles that I found that exclusively reviewed the use of narrative and patient narrative within the UK. And there were lots of articles looking at North America especially. But as a second year student, I didn't feel that I could reflect on the realities of training outside of the UK. So I wanted to look at what was available to us as undergraduates in the UK. So this brought me on to my study protocol. So about participant inclusion. So they were clinical educators with at least 10 years experience teaching undergraduate medical students. Then I went on to perform qualitative semi-structured interviews. And of course, these were recorded, anonymized, transcribed, and then checked back again with the original recordings for accuracy. And of course, all participants gave written informed consent. Anonymization was carried out at every step, and we got ethical approval from the university for the study. So what did I do with these transcripts? So I thought there was lots of really wonderful stories that were shared with me. And I thought I didn't really want to relay these in just a descriptive way. I thought for a broader application, it'd be really good to find common themes and to do a thematic analysis. So I could think about the applications within medical education. So that's what I went on to do. The interviews themselves were semi-structured, so we did have a schedule. which meant that there was allowed for direct comparison against certain questions that all participants were asked. And these are the results. So there's quite a lot going on here. And again, if I'm going through anything and you have any experience of these and you'd like to comment in the chat, please do so, and we can join and think about these things in the discussion. So 5 participants took part, and these are the common themes. So in terms of pedagogical and teaching applications, these from their experience were really broad, really wide-ranging. So you've got everything from patient narratives being a trigger for empathy, reflection, so teaching how to reflect in this sense, communication skills, something that I hadn't considered before, which was patient complaints as teaching opportunities and windows into those first-hand personal narratives, to create a safe space to explore emotive content for students, and practical and adaptive use of patient stories for case-based learning. So thinking about these educators in their personal and professional development, they said that for them, patient narratives have been a gateway to thinking about things such as behaviour modification, informing their own reflective practice, a sense of catharsis, a sense of exploring their own moral injury, and again, empathy. So this does come up quite a lot. And then out of our conversations came suggested modifications to curricula. So more opportunity to debrief was something that I heard quite a lot. And again, I haven't had any experience of this, but if anybody has, please let me know about it in the chat, is either as a student shadowing complaints meetings with patients, or as an educator, if you facilitated that, I would be really interested to hear. So I'd like to talk now a little bit more about empathy, which, as I said, did come up a lot. And I know that this, so on the left, you can see I've asked, can empathy be taught? Now, I know this is quite a problematic question because I've condensed what is quite a complex and nuanced down to just 4 words, and I am aware that that is sort of problematic. So the participants spoke about using patient narratives not necessarily to teach empathy, but as a trigger in reaching students who might otherwise struggle to connect with patient stories of illness. And they all expressed that they were aware that empathy was a quality to be developed over time. It wasn't a discrete domain that they could just teach. And they all used examples from their own practice. And obviously for anonymity, I don't want to share any of those personal details, but all of those accounts did have a certain flavour. There were sometimes very emotive or shocking or challenging experiences, either from their own direct experience or perhaps from their colleagues. And these were perceived as tools, and again, this is another direct quote, to reach hard to reach students and inform them about the realities of patient care. So this is just an overview of the applications for patient narratives as I found them in the study. So for teaching, we've already sort of touched on this. So we've got forming the basis for case-based scenarios, and empathy again is coming up as a very big one, and communication skills. Professionally, they were seen as a trigger for behaviour modification, creating a sense of team cohesion and catharsis. And in between the two, the teaching and professional applications, what was echoed in all the participants' accounts were that there were these key patient stories, and often these were patients that they remembered often from very early on in their careers, and their stories had stayed with them as they progressed through their training. And they were often ones that they would revisit and use for their own reflection and also use in their teaching. And I thought that was very interesting because, as I said, I'm only now a sub F1, but even from my clinical experiences during COVID, I know there are going to be patient interactions that I will remember for the rest of my life. And I want to use these to make myself a better reflective practitioner, but also one day, hopefully, a better teacher. So I thought that was really interesting. And this is how I've sort of reflected on this whole project in light of the situation that we're currently in. And I'd like to draw your attention to sort of the bottom point there under professionalism, which is catharsis. So there's one participant who shared a challenging interaction with a patient that had a negative outcome, and they have shared this openly in their teaching. They found that to be very therapeutic and a really useful educational tool. And they posited to me that seniors and educators perhaps sharing their challenging experiences open the door for students to feel comfortable about sharing their own challenges and maybe their own mistakes as well. And I think we'll touch back on this in a poll at the end, but I thought that was something very interesting to consider. And I'd like to share with you just one direct quote from one of the participants that I think illustrates how broad-ranging patient narratives can be. So this was in response to the question about using patient narratives in their teaching. So allow me to read it for you. Patient narratives are a physical trigger for an emotional response in you, which is a different source of value to a listener who wasn't there. So what I would tend to emphasize in those stories is enough to get the gist, but to really emphasize what it was for me that changed, what it was about my practice that changed, or what it made me think about differently from that experience, at least as much as the experience itself. So I really like this quote because I think there's a lot going on here. We're talking about modification of professional behaviours, reflective practice. We're also talking about using these narratives as a tool to teach reflection, which I think is very interesting. Tonight, to sort of start wrapping up now and just think about some of the limitations of the study, the criticisms of a narrative approach, and again, I really sort of welcome your opinions on that. So the obvious limitation was the small sample size, bias. I was the primary investigator and I was a medical student, speaking to participants who might at some point in my career teach me or who I might work with. So obviously there is some sort of consideration there. And of course, time. I wasn't, because I was doing this in my second and third year as an undergraduate, I wasn't able to increase the sample size beyond that. I just didn't have the time or the scope. And then these criticisms of narrative-based medicine and using patient narratives, this is something that I've only just sort of really started to reflect on now, which is that it's impractical and time-consuming in clinical scenarios. It challenges power hierarchies. It won't appeal to all patients, and I think that's a very valid point. And it's not a substitute for evidence-based approach. And when I was reading this, I was sort of surprised because, again, from my position, I'm only just about to graduate, but I hadn't perceived it as being a substitute. I perceived it as being a tool that we might use along with an evidence-based approach. So that juxtaposition wasn't in my head at that point. But any comments on that, I think that's very interesting, and I welcome those. So these are some points for your consideration, and are based on my reflections throughout the project. So, can we use patient narratives as a tool in medical education? And if so, how should we be doing this? What, if we are using them, what sort of roles do we have in terms of accountability and advocacy for our patients? And then looking to the future, could patient narratives be used to emulate clinical placements during lockdown? And obviously, there is no substitute for being on the wards and going to clinical attachments, but is there some scope for using them there? I think that would be something that I would like to discuss with you. So I'm just going to move on to say thank you for your time. Thank you for listening. If anybody wants to interact with me directly, this is my Twitter handle, and I've just discovered Med Twitter. I've been using it to talk to medical students and educators everywhere, and especially during lockdown. I found this a really useful tool. So if Twitter is for you, this is how you can talk to me about this. I'd like us to do a second poll if that's okay, and then move on to the discussion. So thank you very much for listening to that. So the poll should have popped up for you now, and it should read, do you or would you use anonymised patient narratives from your own experience in your teaching? Yes, both positive and negative interactions. Yes, but only positive interactions. No, maintaining professional distance is important. No, but I would share colleagues' experiences, and other. Please comment in the chat. Okay, so I can just see live as the results are coming in now. So I can see 62%, 64% of you have voted. I'll just give you a little minute to have a think about that. And just to comment on sort of what I thought was a bit of a cheeky response at the end, which was no, but I would talk about my colleagues' experiences. Reflecting on that, I'm sure we've often heard the trope of, I used to work with somebody who did this, or I had seniors or juniors behaved in certain ways, and then just thinking again about our use of language and power, and whether these are appropriate things to share. Okay, so is it possible for us, I don't know if you, to share the results of that poll?
Yes, they should be shared. Can everyone see the results of the poll? I believe it's quite overwhelmingly that people would use positive and negative interactions for anonymised teaching.
Yes, there's 94% of you.
Brilliant. So thank you very much for sharing your award-winning research. I think everyone will agree that it's fascinating insight into patient narratives. So we've got a bit of time now for discussion, and I wanted to start that discussion off by inviting Claire Morris. So Claire, can you hear us?
I can.
Brilliant. So in the chat, you've been talking about this amazing resource, Patient Voices. Would you be able to tell us more about that and how that reflects the themes of today's talk?
Yes, so I can probably show you the resource actually. So Patient Voices is a collection of first-person digital stories. So it's a charity that have spent 10 plus years working with patients and then with their carers, and then have extended into a DNA of care project with healthcare professionals. What's really interesting is it's a residential process. So they work with patients and carers, members of the public, for about 3 days. They have a storytelling circle. You tell your story, work up your narrative, you script your narrative, you choose your photos for your narratives, and they're all about 3 to 5 minutes long. And they're all open access. So if you can see them there, you'll be able to go in and look at them. Some of the stories are actually stories that have been created by medical students, so their own experiences of clinical placements. Some of them there's some more recent stories about during a pandemic. And if you're interested in it as a process, there's also a short documentary where it shows how you work through this process. It's fascinating. I've done it as a patient, as kind of with two hats on really, and told my own story of being a patient through this process. And it leads to some really kind of quite profound kind of facilitated reflective practice. But what's really precious about it is genuinely first person stories. And so I've used them a lot of ways. So I don't teach medical students very much now. Most of my work is with people on master's programs in medical education. I often use the stories quite provocatively to question the purposes of medical education, to question whose voices are heard and not heard in things like curriculum design, to use it to shed light on how some of the decisions we make about curriculum design silence some of the aspects of the practice that are really, really important. So, for example, it's not actually from one of these digital stories. It's a YouTube video. It's a GP talking about his own experiences of his diagnosis of a life-limiting condition. And he talks about how in his care that the technical aspects of care were without fault, but the relational aspects in care were sadly lacking. And I use that to talk about how sometimes not intentionally, but for example, by choosing to design your curriculum through competencies, you then link to kind of observable behaviours or something that's quite reductionist, rather than something that is much more complex and messy and nuanced. So for me, it's often a way of actually creating some perturbation and just questioning our first principles about who do we serve as medical educators, and if we serve patients, to what extent are we being authentic in how we invite them to be part of the conversations about what we do, how we educate, that kind of thing.
Brilliant, thank you. I've got a question in the chat for both of you, if you don't mind. Are there differences in the ease and means of getting the narratives based on age, gender, or ethnicity?
Do you want to go first, Selina?
Sorry, just to repeat that, are the differences in the ease and means?
Yes, in the ease and the means of getting the narratives based on age, gender, or ethnicity.
So I'm assuming in this question you're referring to eliciting these first-hand narratives, patient accounts. And I think, again, I'm only speaking from my limited clinical experience, but yes. So this is what I was trying to allude to when I was talking about the different steps, or as Claire really nicely put it, the different hats that we're all wearing to some extent. So when we were talking about, I suppose, step 4 in these meta-narratives, you are thinking about things, social, cultural contexts of health and illness, storytelling, language, power, gender, ethnicity, that all feeds into that. And it's really, really important to take an approach that considers all of these aspects when you are either eliciting or relaying or using narratives.
Yeah. I would absolutely agree with that. And I think what's been interesting with patient voices is over time how they've actively gathered stories together that touch on those. So if you go and explore the site, there's a collection of stories which are about faith, sexuality and identity. I was involved in a project which actually was with children with multi-system allergic disease, and it's really interesting because there are 2 sets of stories, the stories of the teenagers and the stories of their parents. And actually one of my intercalating students used those to look at, he did a lovely study where he got medical students to write down everything they knew about multi-system complex allergic disease. And then he showed them a couple of these stories and they got them to add. And in their first accounts, they didn't mention the words patients at all. They only taught pathology, and then just showing them these 3-minute clips. And they were saying things like, why don't we not have these in every lecture? Because immediately they were saying, I hadn't thought about the impact on lifestyle. I hadn't thought about the impact on relationships. I hadn't thought about the impact on, a whole load of other things. So I think the more we can be inclusive in the conversations that we have and the narratives we invite, I think that would be really good. So it is worth a look. Some of them are organised by presenting conditions, but others are organised in different ways.
Can I just ask you, Claire, interesting when you're talking about that, about you saying, can I ask at what stage in their training were these students when they were saying?
They were early years students, so year 1 and 2, and it was just such a really simple study, because he basically said, write down everything you know, now watch these stories, which took about 6-9 minutes, and then write in a different colour pen anything else that you notice. And what was also interesting, when they did the second one, they started saying things like, well, I've got asthma and it's never really occurred to me, or I don't like to mention this. So they then started relating it to their own experiences. And it was almost like an invitation to move away from a kind of sole concern about kind of pathology, frankly, and into the wider lived experience. And they were saying, I won't forget this now, because of this story of this kid. They're very evocative. The one of them is called Threatened by a Cheese String, or held at cheese point or something. So a kid talking about being threatened by a cheese string, and actually in the playground, but that actually could kill him. He had such severe anaphylaxis. So because they're patients' own voices, literally, and they choose all the images, and they're often much more hard hitting, I think, than I think we might tiptoe around things a bit more than doing those stories. But I thought that was a very simple study, but it's very interesting.
So I'm aware that time is very short. We've got about 4 minutes left. I'd like to bring someone else on.
Yes.
But in the meantime, this is a question for you, Selina. Oh, where is it? Sorry. Did you find you drew on your background experience of studying literature and or being a linguist at degree level for this study? And if so, in what ways?
The short answer is yes. So I think maybe try and, I know time is against us, but quickly link it to what Claire was saying. So I remember when I was preclinical, so sort of first and second year, finding medicine, those were my most challenging years. And I sort of initially feeling really sorry for myself that I didn't have a degree in biochemistry or pharmacy or something relevant. And I thought there's got to be a way that I can use my previous experience and draw on it. And I think that is what led me to patient narratives. So the question was about in what ways did I use them? So obviously in this particular study, they generated a lot of qualitative data. So my experience was in close textual analysis of literature. So listening to it, typing it up, going back and looking at the language that was used, themes, meaning, even down to like metaphors and similes and things like that. Didn't perhaps relate those to the study, but yes, I found that really helpful. And I think that added to my experience in approaching this and things that I was able to reflect on. I think in other ways, at the end of you ask, was it a hindrance? And I think for this study and for patient narratives in general, no, I think it was very helpful.
So now we've got a new panellist, Carol Munt, who is an expert patient rep and has been doing work with the Doubleday Centre. Would you like to share your experience?
Several years ago, I met Ravina Shah, who is one of the leaders on the Doubleday project, and that was predominantly to get patients more involved in the teaching of medical students. I think patient stories are brilliant, don't get me wrong, but I think there's something also to be said for face-to-face contact, and I think that's where possibly the fact that we have to do everything virtually now will come, face-to-face will come into its own, because I think patients who've got certain conditions, who've had them for a number of years, who pretty much manage their own conditions as well, have an awful lot to share. And the one thing that is so important is that medical students should never end up coming out and being qualified thinking that patients are diagnoses and conditions and need treatment. Patients are people who've got a real story to tell. They've got the worries about their condition. They've got, in some cases, ways that they've overcome problems to do with their condition. And wherever you've had patient peer groups together sharing ideas, it's been found that it's been very beneficial. So I think having a patient talking to a group of people is very useful. And one of the things that happened in Reading when we set up the Physician Associates course was that myself and a colleague were involved in helping to set the course up, in interviewing all of the people who wanted to take part, and in suggesting things that could make the course that much more user-friendly, if you like. Even something as simple as my suggestion was that all of the prospective physician associates should be asked to sit for 20 minutes wearing a hospital gown. And then perhaps they'd realise how much of a problem it is for patients when they're put in that position, and how much it makes you feel very vulnerable. And I think that most of the students felt that was a very simple exercise, but actually quite a useful one. So I think there's no question in my mind that we've got to use the people that we're going to end up treating. I mean, I'm a qualified nurse, I'm not a doctor, but I know that I learned a lot when I was a student nurse from some of the patients that I had that I'd sit and chat to during night duty. And you do remember your patients forever, certain patients, and it does certainly give you, it teaches you that patients are people, that they've got a story to tell more than just about their condition. You've got a man in bed 7 who's got diabetes. You've got a chap in bed 7 who's married, who's worried stupid that he's going to lose his driving license and therefore lose his job. His wife's really worried because she doesn't know why he's been having mood swings when he's gone hypo. It's all of that that's necessary and that makes a difference to the treatment and how effective the treatment is. You have to look at patients as being holistic. It's a whole holistic thing. That's a word that I find quite ambiguous, but I think patients can add a lot. An expert patient, I think, is a fairly good comment. I've had narcolepsy now since a really bad car smash, when I had a brain hemorrhage and I had a fractured skull, brain hemorrhage, and I was in a coma for 10 days. And they found afterwards that one of the side effects, or one of the effects of the accident, was that I've got type 1 narcolepsy. And believe you me, I know more about that than anybody else, but only as it relates to me. But as I said, I gave a talk at the King's Fund, and I said, one of the things that I'm very conscious of is my consultant has got about 150 other patients with narcolepsy. He's also got about another 50 different conditions that he needs to be an expert in. And I know more about narcolepsy than he will ever know.
Carol,
it's like to live with it. So that's why I think we're useful to medical students.
Carol, I was just going to ask, thank you so much for sharing that. I was going to say, ask you a little bit about, do you find it empowering? Are you happy to share those stories with students?
Absolutely. And I think I think one of the biggest problems is finding people that are happy to do that, and finding people that are happy to be cross-examined, if you like. Because sometimes people have certain conditions that they don't particularly want to talk about. They don't want to go into the detail of how it affects them mentally, for example. They don't particularly want to say that, well, it makes me really depressed, or, something like that. But I think there are a number of expert patients that are more than happy to share their story, simply because they know it will benefit themselves, the medical students, and other patients. And I think that's the crucial bit. I talk about mine, and I talk about co-production because I want it to happen. I want it to make, to benefit everybody else. And I'm not being philanthropic or anything else. It's just that it's common sense. But I thought your survey, that was absolutely brilliant. And I'm so pleased that I clocked into this. So
thank you so much for that.
If I send you a link to the Doubleday Centre, it might be worth you actually letting them know how much work you've done. That would be quite useful.
Yeah, please do tweet me, pop it in the chat for us all to see. That would be lovely.
I'll tweet you. Can I DM you, direct message you?
Of course.
Okay.
Brilliant. Thank you, Carol. I'm aware that we're running over slightly, and I know that, Selina, you've got another commitment.
It's only graduation, it's fine. It's just...
it's only graduation.
I love it.
So do you have any closing comments for us before we finish the session?
Just like to say, I'm really overwhelmed by how the questions that we've had, the insight. Really, really honoured that you've engaged with the study in this way. And I know there's so much more that we could talk about. And one just tiny little thing that I wanted to think about is when we were going back to that first step is us as engaging in talking about our own stories of illness and when we might be patients, is to think about that also we wear different hats. We can be doctors, patients, or, as Carol was saying, nurses and patients, and that's a really interesting relationship that I know we've not got time to go into, but I think that's under the scope of patient narratives as well. And yes, thank you all so much for your contributions today. It's been lovely.
Yes, thank you everyone, and thank you, Selina, for kicking off a fascinating discussion today. So thank you everyone for participating in the session today. A video of the session will be made available on the ASME website in a few days. And for any questions that we didn't get to in the chat, we'll make sure to write some answers for those as well. Our next ASME Bite-Size session is on Tuesday the 21st of July. It's at 12 noon with Professor Sally Sandover and Professor Julia Blitz, who will be in conversation with ASME's chair, Sandra Nicholson, and fourth year QMUL student Lucas Julian about his research into the issues of social accountability within 3 undergraduate curricula, and the interesting thing that it's 3 undergraduate curricula over 3 continents, which, yeah, so that's really unmissable stuff. For more details, make sure to visit the ASME events page, and thank you very much for attending, and thank you, Selina.
Thank you.
Brilliant. So enjoy the rest of your afternoon. Thank you.